Today's edition of Committee for Sydney Live. I'm Gabriel Metcalf. I'm the CEO of the committee. We are today going to have an important conversation about what a just recovery might look like. We may not have all the answers, but it is an urgent question to ask because for too many people, the old normal was not working, and the idea of just trying to get back as quickly as possible to the old normal is not enough. We want to hold ourselves to a higher standard than that, and we want to ask what it would take to have a recovery that includes everyone. We are going to have an incredible group of panelists. My job is really just to hold the conversation, which means introduce them and ask questions. Today is the last day of Reconciliation Week and a reminder that Australia still has a long way to go, seeing true equity for Aboriginal people. It's also a day that has seen America shaken to its foundations by racially structured violence once again. I can't believe it's 2020 and we are still having this conversation about America. But I guess, yeah, it feels relevant for what we're talking about today. America and Australia are different countries with different stories and different futures, but also share some similar challenges. And certainly me being here is part of a belief that we can learn from each other. So on a day when we are once again watching the cities of America burn, it's a reminder about how far we have to go in the work of racial inclusion. With that as my introduction, I would like to invite Yvonne Weldon, who is the chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Lands Council, to conduct a welcome to country.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers. I stand before you on the land of Eora. I've grown physically on this land, but in my blood and always in spirit, I am Wiradjuri. As was said, my name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a sovereign woman. I come from Cowra here in New South Wales. I am the elected chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the cultural authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land I am standing on. I would like to pay my respects to all elders past and present, and to all First Nations, and to you and the ancestors of the lands that you are on. Welcome to country is an age-old tradition. It is more than just words, it is a spiritual process for honouring the ancestors' footsteps we are all walking in, continuing the practice of the generations before us to the many generations to come. The boundaries of the traditional owners are written into the earth's natural landscapes. The boundaries of the Eora are the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders and the members, I welcome everyone to the land of the Gadigal. I acknowledge the Gadigal people and also the people of the lands that you are on, whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with these lands, our Mother Earth. Across this continent, there are hundreds of nations, tribes and clans that have existed here for over 60,000 years. This country's First Nations people are the oldest living culture of the world. As we are all joined online, let us all remember and acknowledge the many warriors that created pathways for all of us, the ones recognised and the ones we've never heard of. My people have always listened and learned from each other, the environment, animals, our elements, and also our ancestors. We don't live in isolation of body, culture, spirit, land and water because we are one. We need to reflect upon the footsteps we're leaving to know where we are heading, shaping a society, a country we can be proud of. In these times of this pandemic, don't let the social distance make us socially absent. We must maintain physical distancing, but not creating barriers to our social connections. Whether it's through your work or networks, creating an inclusion, an acceptance, and a resilience. All of us together can bring about a positive change to multiple generations, starting a healing to the past generations by declaring what should not have taken place, to the present day generations, giving them hope, and creating a future for the next generations, for everyone in this country. As it is Reconciliation Week, we have so many milestones to reflect upon. National Sorry Day, the anniversaries of the Bringing Them Home report, the Mabo decision, and the referendum. Since the 67 referendum and some of this recognition, there is still so much more to be done. We are in this together. We can achieve positive change each and every day towards a reconciled future, bringing my people, your people, and all our people together. As we pondered over these important milestones this week, think about what difference you are making today. Will that become a milestone of the future? So let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you.
You're muted, Gabriel.
You'd think I'd be good at remembering that after all of these. Thank you for telling me. Yvonne, thank you, and thank you for joining the panel discussion as well. Let me just briefly introduce the rest of the panel. Joanna Quilty is the CEO of the New South Wales Council of Social Services, which is the peak body representing not-for-profits and charities in New South Wales. Mel Gatfield is the Secretary of the United Workers Union for New South Wales, which represents low-income workers, including hospitality workers and cleaners. Bronwen Clark is the EO of the National Growth Areas Alliance, which represents councils in peri-urban areas on the fringes of our cities. So welcome to all of you. And let me just start this with the overarching question for each of you. What do we need to do differently to ensure the recovery following COVID-19 is just? How do we ensure that we end up with a more equal society through the recovery? Why don't we start with Joanna?
Thank you very much, Gabriel, and thank you for the opportunity to participate today. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and also to thank you, Yvonne, for such a warm and generous welcome to country, and to acknowledge what a powerful and inspiring Aboriginal woman and Aboriginal leader that you are, and for your continued inspiration in that regard when there is much to despair about. So I really appreciate and value that, and thank you. Look, I think it is a great question, Gabrielle, and we know from our past experience with pandemics of this nature and with disasters, be they floods or bushfires, that it is people on the lowest incomes and with other vulnerabilities who fare the worst, and that there is inequality of suffering as a result of these events. I don't think we have actually learnt the lessons though. If you think back to the GFC, we kind of held our breath and then let out a collective sigh of relief. And for many of us, we reverted to business as usual and just got on with things. I think we know, though, that for others, the inequality gap widened and that life got a hell of a lot tougher. And it's really been the brutality and the enormity, I think, of the COVID-19 crisis that we're dealing with that has thrown into sharp relief the extent of that inequality and that disparity, so that we now see that we've got, unchecked consumption existing alongside quite extreme poverty. We've got all the benefits of new technology and hyperconnectivity, and yet we still have so many who are socially isolated and on the margins. We have so much more in terms of flexibility, mobility and innovation in our workplaces. And at the same time, we have rising underemployment, casualised work and insecure work. we have, I think there's still that opportunity for enormous wealth creation and property acquisition for some, at the same time that home ownership is becoming completely out of reach for others. And when we look at climate change, we have never had more information, more data, technological and other solutions at hand, and yet we have inaction. So I think we are finally and fully seeing the full extent of the inequality that exists within our society. And while I'm sure that most of us who are involved in this seminar have been able to quite quickly move to working from home and to make adjustments, but we've basically kept our jobs and things are continuing on. Even from that very comfortable vantage point, I think we can see that there are those in our communities who are suffering enormously. None of us could have missed those long snaking queues that formed outside of Centrelink on that Monday morning back in March. Or if you've come into the city and you were in March, we were seeing homeless people walking through the city looking completely distressed and confused. The media, the statistics, our own first-hand knowledge tells us that it is those in the lower paid, casualised jobs where women and young people are overrepresented who are being affected. We know that people who are homeless or who are in very insecure and unsafe housing are also being disproportionately affected. People with underlying chronic health conditions who don't have access to good health care are also in the firing line. The list goes on. We know that there are groups out there who have been incredibly impacted, some of whom will never recover. So it is a moment in time, I think, where we do need to learn the lessons and where we do need to have a massive reset. And I think that we need to get the fundamentals right. And I think that there are 6 areas where we need to focus our efforts. So firstly, it's as plain as day, and we've known it for a long time, but we can no longer ignore it. The income support system is broken. That level of New Start was just absolutely appallingly unlivable, and we cannot go back to that. But we also know that the system itself, Centrelink, was designed to stop people accessing New Start. It was to make it as hard as possible, to put in place barriers. And there were various punitive measures also that were applied. Some of those have been lifted, and I think this now provides us, and we've seen the absolute value of giving people more money. Who knew? You know, it enables people to buy fresh food and vegetables, to get dental work done, to get car repairs done, to pay electricity bills. The doubling of the rate has shown us the enormous potential and possibilities that come from giving people a reasonable basis on which to live. I think we're also fully aware that we need tax reform, that the time is nigh. There are too many concessions provided to those that actually don't need them. It's very inextricably linked to state revenue bases as well, and we know that for us to be sustainable into the future and to be able to afford to pay for the many services and supports that our communities demand and need, we do need to re-look at the tax system, and we need tax reform. I think we also know that our housing model is wrong. We've for so long had home ownership as the holy grail, when really it should be about affordable and stable, secure accommodation for all. So home ownership is really just one part of that picture. We also need to look at how do we make renting a more long-term viable option for people. What other models can we have in the mix, be it rent to buy, build to rent, shared equity models? But we can't leave it just to the private sector. We also need to have government in there sitting at the table, and we need our community housing providers in there as well. I think the impact on our homeless people, the sheer magnitude of the problem of homelessness in New South Wales is something we need to urgently address. I think we cannot kid ourselves. Discrimination is alive and well, and it's deeply ingrained in our institutions and our systems and in our culture. As the Premier said this morning, what's going on in America needs to be a wake-up call for us here. We know that it's about racism and it's about poverty, both of which are happening here right under our noses. We've had so many inquiries and commissions over decades. So how else do we explain the continued overrepresentation of Aboriginal communities when it comes to disadvantage, when it comes to poorer health outcomes, lower life expectancies, higher rates of, illiteracy and unemployment, and the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children and young people in the child protection system, out-of-home care, juvenile justice, the criminal justice system. How can we have achieved so little in 2020 and indeed have gone backwards in many ways? So I think we do have to tackle that big issue of discrimination and racism. And a First Nations voice to Parliament embedded in the Constitution would have been a great start. Let us hope that we have not missed that opportunity. I think the fifth area that we really need to tackle is the digital divide. It is absolutely real, and this pandemic has highlighted that. If we want people to be able to connect, to get services and support online, to be able to make the most of employment and education opportunities, or simply to just stay in contact with families and friends, then we have to address connectivity and issues of accessibility, affordability, and capabilities. It's an essential service, and this pandemic has highlighted it. There are initiatives to get equipment and data and other things out to those communities in need, but I think we're not yet tackling it at a systematic level. I think a beautiful thing that this pandemic has shown is that the social services sector provides essential services. We're not just charitable do-gooders. It's not all about volunteering. Very much like nurses, paramedics, teachers, others at the front line, our workers provide really vital support. And that needs to be recognised, and we need to fund the work appropriately. It also needs to be recognised that the macro policy settings, the economic conditions have a direct impact on the level of need in our communities and demand on services, and yet there is no growth funding. So how do we reconcile that? We really need to come up with a way of understanding that these services are at the front line, and when circumstances change, they need to be supported to be able to provide, to meet that increased demand. So they are my 6 areas of focus. And I actually think, even though I have moments of despair and moments of feeling anxious and worried that we aren't going to make the most of this opportunity, I think there is actually reason for optimism. I think we have seen some really positive things that have happened and that have happened really quickly, things that we wouldn't have thought were at all possible at the beginning of the year. So things like the doubling of JobSeeker, which has been on the agenda and people have been advocating for a very long time. The 34 million that the state government has put into finding temporary accommodation for homeless people, and the ability to move really quickly to find those solutions, and to the really high degree of collaboration between government and the sector in doing that has been, I think, really inspiring. There's also been some new money coming into the system, albeit one-off, but additional funding for tenancy services, for domestic violence, for community legal services, and that's incredibly positive. I think we've seen Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal organisations really rise to the challenge of protecting their communities and protecting their elders, and doing a fantastic job in that regard. And I think our sector has shown that it is flexible, that it is solution focused, that it can be trusted to provide sound and practical advice and to work with government to put in place solutions. But my one word of caution is that we won't be able to capitalise on these extremely positive developments if it is just the voices of civil society speaking out on these things. I think we do need to hear other voices, and we do need to join together and to collectively demand that we get these responses. So I will leave it there, as I may well have gone over my time, but thank you.
Just a little, but thank you, amazing. Mel, let's go to you now. What do we need to be doing to bring about a just recovery?
Thanks, Gabrielle, and thanks for the opportunity to talk. As Joanne said, I'm very lucky to be able to be working from home, but the union that I represent is the United Workers Union, and our members work across hundreds of different parts of New South Wales and Sydney, and work in really essential supply chains doing essential work. And our members are really proud of the work that they do. So just to give you a bit of a feel, we've got warehouse workers and food process workers ensuring that we've got food and the food is getting to our shops. We've got early childhood educators who are caring for our children, cleaners who are making sure that our schools are clean, that our offices are clean, that the public have confidence that they can go back out into the world. Home care workers that have consistently throughout the crisis been going into people's homes and providing the opportunity for people to stay at home and live in dignity. And the most devastating part of our membership by this pandemic was the hospitality sector. So overnight, you know, thousands and thousands of people were put out of work. And what has happened for our members is that a lot of the work that they do has finally been recognised as essential. It's always been essential, but it's actually now being recognised that. But the work is often undervalued and really is the subject of, you know, really precarious working situations. So lots of casual work, lots of underemployment, low pay, and really no respect for the work that people do. And unfortunately, what we've seen in this pandemic is that a bunch of our members have been left behind. So people that haven't qualified because of their casual employment for JobKeeper, or a number of our members are international students who make up a big part of Sydney's economy, and they were completely left behind, told to go home when they couldn't go home, and have really been struggling. And I think that that's a thing that we really need to change. So what are the key things that we can do differently? I think it's about recognition and respect for people in these essential services, making sure that we support international students, making sure that people have access to secure jobs, making sure in the current environment that everyone has access to paid pandemic leave. So all of us have that confidence that we can follow the medical advice, and when we're sick, we stay at home. And a lot of members of ours just don't have access to those important things. The other thing, people are talking about infrastructure and the importance of investing in infrastructure, and I just never hear people talk about the infrastructure of care. How are we going to invest in early childhood education? How are we going to invest in home care? In New South Wales, there's thousands and thousands of our elderly and frail communities waiting to get access to home care. Why isn't that work recognised? Why don't we build funding into making sure that those jobs are secure and meaningful? And a lot of the people that do those jobs are women. And again, I just feel that those areas have been undervalued. What can we do to make a difference? We can think about government and business as the procurer of services. We are asking government and businesses to sign up to a cleaner solution to make sure that the public have confidence going back into the world by providing cleaners with decent paying conditions, decent training, making sure that they've got an equipment. So there's some really practical things that can happen. But I might leave it there and hear what others have to say. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, thanks, Mel. Bronwen, let's get you in. What should we be doing to enable a just recovery?
Thanks, Gabrielle, and thanks everyone for your comments. I'd quickly like to acknowledge that today I'm working from the northern suburbs of Melbourne, so I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. There are so many things that we could do. We represent local government in those fast-growing outer suburban areas, and so people listening in might be surprised how fast Sydney actually goes these days. We're talking about, we represent councils like Wallandilly Shire Council, Liverpool, Camden, Penrith, Blacktown, and Western Sydney, the outer suburbs, goes far beyond what a lot of people realise. And we're talking in Sydney around 1.5 million people. Nationally, 5 million people, or a fifth of Australia's population lives in these outer suburban areas. And they've grown so quickly. They've doubled in size, in population size, in one generation. And we're at the moment, so pre-COVID, experiencing significant deficits in infrastructure investment, service delivery, high levels of social isolation, and just that lack of planning and sequencing for what people need to be able to live full, prosperous lives. Post-COVID, there's some scary scenarios ahead. We know that households in outer suburban areas have some of the highest mortgage stress rates in the country. We know that it's predominantly young families, households of young families, and we know predominantly people are employed in those sectors hardest hit by the economic downturn. So it's a perfect storm. It's for a really sort of scary scenario evolving. So what can we do? We are focusing on a few key areas, and one of them is around our young people. So across the country, within the next 10 years, there'll be another 1 million young people looking for work or study options. And we know that they're going to be hardest hit in terms of employment and career development. We know that in outer suburban areas, there's already a significant skills deficit, where only 13% of young people attain a bachelor's degree compared to 19% nationally. So one of our advocacy platforms is around harnessing that youth population. So better access to local vocational training and higher education, putting more campuses out in outer suburban areas. Looking at employment factors. If ever there was a time for all of this construction blitz and major projects by state and federal government to have a youth employment criteria, then this is it. We really need to make sure that we don't leave that generation behind, that they don't miss out, and in 10 years' time we've got millions of young people who just haven't had the opportunity that previous generations have. Another option that we're looking at, another area that we think really needs focus, is the continuation of working from home. When people in our areas, in growth areas, sometimes commute up to 2 hours a day each way to get to work. So if we can hold on to this practice of working from home or working locally, that's going to save a lot of people a lot of money on transport. It's going to be much better for their health, a lot lower stress levels, better for family and community. So we think, the just recovery will be allowing people to work from home where they can, where their job allows, or creating places near home. So co-working spaces, business hubs, business incubators, looking at shared facilities so that people can enjoy working in their local community and all the flow-on effects from that. So that's impacting the local economy. They'll buy a coffee at the local cafe, or they'll be home in time to take kids to sport. So the positive impact does have its risks as well. I think we really need to start planning greenfield developments and planning communities as job centres as well as residential areas for the labour market. Finally, the thing that we're really trying to push through is the critical role of local government in this. They're very connected to their communities, their grassroots, they're on the ground, they're set up. And we haven't seen, you know, from our perspective, a sufficient level of support from state and federal governments, or recognition of all of these newly vulnerable communities that are emerging, that, you know, local government is going out of its way or adding services, broadening their scope to support them. And that's not going to, that need is not going to go away anytime soon. So I think we just need to make sure local government is properly supported to do what their community needs them to do.
Okay, thank you. We'll move to Yvonne next, and everybody feel free to start submitting questions via the Q&A app on Zoom, and I will do my best to sort through them. Yvonne, what do you think needs to be done to bring about a just recovery?
It's really, I mean, I've been brought in onto this discussion fairly late in the piece, but certainly some of my reflection since the reach out from the Committee for Sydney, there's been so many things that go through my mind. Specifically, I think that, you know, the question is really difficult to answer from an Aboriginal perspective because there's an assumption that was just in the first place. From my people, you know, there's so much more that needs to be done. We're not at the same point. I think that, you know, justice, and whether it be, you know, about how we respond post-COVID, but yet prior to going to COVID, there were so many other challenges that have continually been an issue for my people in both, you know, local, state and federal government. And from a Metro perspective, we've lost 95% of our income since COVID. We are not heavily funded by government. In fact, we get an allocation from the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. We don't get any government funding. And so the income generation that we do in terms of providing welcome to country and other cultural services goes back into community. So that income generation is not there at the moment. And I appreciate that the Committee of Sydney have engaged Metro today to be able to provide the additional supports. But, you know, there is so much more that needs to be done in terms of what we value for Aboriginal people in this country. You know, whether it's in Sydney or whether it's in, you know, other parts of New South Wales or even broader for the whole of the country, we're not talking about the same things. I mean, there was also rescue packages or sort of packages that were being done in the Aboriginal space, and the first port of call was rural remote. There's an assumption that when you are in these built-up areas such as Sydney, that because there's so many service providers out there that get support or receive really well-funded, you know, programs, often at the expense of Aboriginal communities, that doesn't mean that Aboriginal people are accessing those services, and they may not access those services for a whole range of reasons, both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. And so we're not also looking at what is happening in our local communities and what is being funded in those local communities, and if they are fairly and equitably provided, because they aren't always. And so the difficulty with that is, like, you might see Metro Land Council and you might see another organisation down the road that is well funded, it's got really good PR, or you might see an Aboriginal organisation that funds, you know, a sporting event and the likes. They may be funded often at that other level, but the community access to service provision is not always the same. And so I think that some of the greatest challenges for Aboriginal people, and all of the issues that both Mel, Joanna and Bronwen have discussed today, there are a lot of barriers. And so to be able to really address those barriers, whether it's what's going on in the States or even in some of the protests or the discussions and the rallies that are taking place in this country, they're long overdue, but they shouldn't actually have to be addressed from a detrimental outcome. They should be discussed ordinarily. And I take my point, particularly with some of our land developments that Metro has been constantly rejected. We have, you know, moved away from selling off whatever assets that we have to try and enter in joint ventures, and so there's some sustainability for our community and for our members, but also for generations to come. We've got councils we work with 26 councils alone within our boundaries, and the amount of racism that we deal with from those councils is absolutely appalling. We have our developments that are continually being rejected. We've also had one development in a council in in Sydney where they refuse to make a decision. We have approached different parts of government, ministry, bureaucracy and the like, and yet we still can't get that change. So how do we ever get financially viable if there isn't any justice around that? So for me, these issues are very complex, but they are basic as well. The basic rights of what Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal people have access to, Aboriginal people do not. And so I think we often think that, oh, that there isn't this systemic racism. Ask an Aboriginal person and they'll tell you that it is, because they don't see the same treatment. And so whether it's actually about the deaths in custody, or whether it's about us accessing services, there's so much more to be done in all of our patches. And particularly, I think that we often assume, because we can see a glossy brochure, that there is real progress being made, but it comes back to what we are seeing in our homes and in our local communities and what that impacts there. There's an assumption that, even this Zoom meeting or Skype or MS Teams and everything else that goes on, there's an assumption that all of our stakeholders out there have access to resources that they can tap into these events, or to be able to be connected. I mean, we know that for many years there was lots of debate around NBN and what that meant for this country. I mean, we are seeing the product of that every day playing out in our homes if we're trying to work from home. So there's a lot of assumptions, and there's the pathway, I think, for me, in what is the headline or what is a policy, and what that means in our everyday lives. They may be very different. And I think that, as Joanna said, around the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people and the underrepresentation of Aboriginal people in all of our lives, whether you are talking about the local coffee shop and is an Aboriginal person employed there, or, are you talking about the person on the front line in the supermarket, Mel, or, are they cleaners? I mean, we often talk about the stats, but the human toll in our society is that often we're never going to be at a just place. And I think we need to talk about just being the word, and also acknowledge the fact that we're not starting from the same point.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, all of you. Very powerful and far-reaching overview statements. So I'm getting lots of questions in. Everybody feel free to submit them. A couple of questions are getting at the trade-off that's going to be very difficult as we're in what some people say will be the biggest recession since the 1930s. So there will be less money. So governments all over the world will be borrowing, certainly, but also will be having to make cuts. And so faced with a lot of really hard choices, what do you guys think about the trade-off about paying essential workers more based on the essentialness of the work they're doing, rather than paying them as little as possible because they can be easily replaced, which is generally how wages are set, I suppose. But that would, of course, drive up the cost of services to government and potentially force other cuts somewhere else. What is the right way to think about these complicated trade-offs? Maybe I'll start with you, Mel, to get you in on that. And then anyone else who wants to jump in.
I think the trade-off that we make all the time is that by not respecting those essential workers like cleaners and care sector workers, we are undermining the environments that we live in. And we now know how important it is that things are going to be clean, and how vital that we can see that to pay people a decent minimum wage. Most cleaners are paid on award wages. To pay them a decent wage and to give people enough time to do the job and basic equipment it shouldn't be a trade-off in our society. And every dollar that a cleaner gets is going to be reinvested back into the economy. So I think that Joanna would probably be able to speak to this more clearly, but you can see that as the job seeker and job keeper payments have flown through the economy, the majority of that money is being spent automatically. So I question, what is the trade-off? We would have clean environments where we feel safe to work and have our children at school, and people will have a decent life and have that respect and have some money in their pocket that they can then spend. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, so no trade-offs.
And Gabrielle,
Joanna,
I think we need to recognise the gendered nature of the issue, and the fact that a lot of the work that we're talking about that is really low paid and casualised and insecure is work that is predominantly done by women, and we still have an enormous gender pay gap in Australia, and we need to move beyond that. And I think that we pay the price if we don't. I mean, what we're looking at in the States is a far more extreme version of where we might be heading if we don't take the right steps now, and they are paying the price. I mean, you have people with really poor health quality, poor quality of life, more people living in really desperate circumstances because they are not given the opportunities and the equality of opportunity that we should be able to provide in the 21st century.
Joanna, you said in your opening remarks, reform taxes, I think, to generate more money so government can do things like pay people better. How exactly do you think the tax system should be changed to do that?
Well, I think we have known for a long time that it has become this unwieldy system that we've just continued to build on and tinker with and change, and that we haven't fundamentally gone back and reformed it so that it is fit for purpose in the 21st century. And certainly a lot of those concessional treatments for, superannuation, for in relation to negative gearing, in relation to franking credits. I know it is politically incredibly hard to wind those things back, but really we've got to look at being equitable, being more transparent and fair and robust into the future. And I think it all has to be on the table. And I think it is inextricably linked to state revenue as well. And when we look at what's going on in New South Wales, we know that, stamp duty is a very unreliable basis on which to be collecting revenue. We know that reliance on gambling taxes, I mean, that's just horrendous that has to be part of the consideration. So I think it all needs to be in the mix, and we do need to revisit it in a really fundamental way.
Yvonne, a question for you. How has COVID been affecting Aboriginal communities so far, and what do you see as the path forward as we enter the next stage with this pandemic?
And I think that, the isolation has been difficult, but also seeing that, even though my people are often, because of the other health impacts, that we are most extremely vulnerable as a result of that. But I think some of the benefits of what we have lived through, not just with this pandemic, but our resilience as First Nations people of this country, we have been through a lot in the last 232 years. So we certainly, that lived experience and what we are able to adapt, I think that's been certainly a strength. But my concern is that often the problem is that government, one of the first things that often get cut are Aboriginal services or Aboriginal priorities, and because there are bigger issues. But the greatest issues that Aboriginal people are never seem to be core to all of the other issues. And so when you look at it in a holistic way, and yes, we say we're all Australian, we're all in this together, but when you look at these issues, if you've already got a deficit on how you've treated a particular group, minorities in your country, and certainly the First Nations, there's so much more that needs to be done. In terms of moving forward, I think that we have to be at the table, and we also need to be a key point in the focus, because if we can't get a development because we've got, you know, and no one wants to really talk about the R word being racism, if we actually don't start to address that stuff, and I know that people will say, oh, but that's sort of not really front of mind because we've got all these other things to address, then that brings extra challenges for us because we never get to address it. And I think that it often gets down the bottom of the list, and particularly Aboriginal people, and some of the fundamentals of what we have not changed. So whether that is through, you know, addressing local governments that they are not responding or are not including Aboriginal you know, development in the same way that they're doing others, or if we're not actually making sure that we're accessing or we recognise. So, for example, a lot of our Aboriginal organisations, I volunteer for an Aboriginal organisation, the Aboriginal Children's Service, we get zero funding. We all pool our funds together and we pay our electricity, and we luckily get food donated from Oz Harvest, and we feed roughly 180 people each week, all are volunteers, not 1 cent is actually contributed. We don't do any major fundraising, but no one actually comes to us to contribute to what we do. We just pool our own resources for each other. And that's for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. And so how do we be more inclusive? I mean, this actual organisation was created because, and it was created, you know, it was one of the first Aboriginal organisations created in Redfern, and when we didn't continue to get funded under, you know, previous governments, we continued to provide service provision because there was a need there. How do your volunteers, and Aboriginal organisations are heavily reliant, and a lot of the organisations, the non-profits, and I'm talking about non-profits in real sense of non-profits, because we've seen the non-profits that are real large corporate services. How do we make sure that they are supported, because they have their own volunteers that are even more marginalised? They couldn't attract any additional dollars or benefits because they're not regarded as employed, because they're not employed, because they're volunteers. So they didn't attract the additional dollars that was available to others that were employed. And so the difficulty is that the starting point is so very different. And I think that in moving forward, I think that we need to make sure that what we refer to as community is not always the same for you as it is for me, and it's not the same across, whether it be Sydney, across New South Wales, or across the country. And so, you know, if we compare to going having a fight over toilet paper in a supermarket in Sydney, but going into, you know, a remote part of the Northern Territory and even being able to afford the toilet paper in the first place. I mean, I've been up there, and, you know, you could buy 2 chops that would cost you $45. How could you even eat in the first place? And that was prior to COVID. So what would those additional marginalisations be taking place today with those other impacts? And so, you know, you can put a fairly tight way around how we're managing the spread of this, but are we also addressing some of the other things that existed prior to? And moving forward, I think we need to address the prior to be able to get to the post.
A question for all of you. The last couple of months of lockdown has been an experiment in one way you could think about it, with new government programs, more people working from home if they have the kind of job that lets them do that, lots of things. So question is, thinking about a just recovery, what is, for each of you, one thing you would like to continue from this last couple of months? And what is one thing you would like to stop and not bring forward? And maybe Bronwen, start with you.
Sure. I'd like to see continued, local impact. So people being able to have the time, so to give up their lengthy commute into the city or to the other side of the city, and have time to do productive, meaningful work at home if they can, because that does have such profound flow-on effects for their family, their community, and what that means down the track is, we might need to invest in better parks and open space and bike trails, walking paths. So I think that has real potential to shift our economic activity to where people already are. And, you know, I think that has a really positive impact, and I'd love to see that continue. Something that I'd like to see cease is, I suppose, and I suppose part of it is just because of the timing and what's going on, but the scrambling, the sort of fairly piecemeal approach between federal and state government to identifying the real issues and addressing them. You know, we've got some of our members who now have, you know, applications in for 20 or 30 different things, and where's the coordination, and where's that, you know, I'd love to see that levels of government working together to really address this in a meaningful way and take up the opportunities in a meaningful way.
Joanna, what's one thing you'd like to stop and one thing you'd like to keep?
I think in terms of keep, it's definitely that ability to collaborate, to work with government as real partners. So I think in the past there's been a lot of talk about partnerships and collaboration, but there hasn't always felt like there's been any real change or practical application of that. But I think in the last few months we have seen it happen. We've been treated as equals. We've been seen to have, you know, valuable advice and information and experience to bring to the table. And we have been able to move really quickly and develop solutions. And that's just been fantastic. And I think we absolutely want to retain that and build on it and continue that into the future. In terms of what I think we can do away with, it's not so much ceasing, and it builds on what Bronwen was saying, but I go to a lot of Zooms and there's so many conversations and discussions going on, but it does feel like we're talking around the same issues over and over again. And I think there's got to be a point where we stop the talking and we start the doing. And it is to do with that piecemeal, reactive, hurried response. And I think there does need to be an overarching plan. We do need to be thinking about both the quick wins and the short to medium term, but also the longer term, if we really do want to build back better.
Yvonne, how about you? Something you'd like to stop and something you'd like to continue?
I think I agree with Joanna. I think that the online meetings, I'm concerned that I think they're full on, and I know it's essential to keep the engagement happening and ensuring that we are being collaborative, or, you know, we are considering all the issues. I'm certainly hoping that this does not continue into the post-COVID world, because I think that we're already often working so many hours. You know, we have mobile phones where we can access emails quite readily, and I'm concerned that this will become our norm, and we already are quite stretched in terms of how we respond to everything, and so I don't think we get enough quality time to be without all of these things. And so although I think there's some real benefits and it's been great, and it's great that you can have online meetings and events such as this, but I think that when that starts to creep into your regular day more and more, I mean, I've had days where I've had 8 hours of Zoom, Skype, MS Team meetings and Google Team meetings, or whatever they're called. I mean, I feel like I'm going mad half the time. But so although I don't think, you know, I think it certainly serves a purpose, I don't think it should be stock standard for how we engage, because one of the key things I think, which is has been a benefit really, is that how we've engaged with our own. You know, and I know we've had isolation, that we haven't been able to go and visit others, but certainly even within your family or your friends network, your neighbourhood, I think that's an important part of how we connect. But the thing that I wish would continue in this country is that the value system of what, only because of a crisis, has essential service provision, whether that be each and every one of us, or even in our family, or our friends, or our own networks, that for once that people have actually stopped to look at us from a bean counter's perspective. They've seen the value in what we provide from a human perspective, and I would like to see more of that. I think that's an important part of if we are, you know, and I wonder whether the protests that are taking place and the rallies that are taking place, that if we hadn't been seeing for the last, you know, couple of months about our isolation and how we've all been treated within, but also seeing what's been treated externally as well. And I think that, you know, if government starts to look at, you know, certainly from a federal perspective, I don't think that they see what takes place locally to be of the same value that they have more recently. So I'd like to see that more investment happen into what us essential workers, but also just us essentially in what we contribute to society needs to continue.
Mel, something you'd like to continue, something you'd like to not continue?
As far as not continue, I would like us to not continue employing people in insecure ways and in casual ways. I think that we need to be innovative about our work, and I think that we should start to consider things like, you know, universal leave banks, so people can take their leave from job to job, and then in times like this be able to access leave. Things I'd like to keep, I think that we should keep the job seeker payment. I think that's a really good security for all Australians, and I'm scared that people are talking about removing that. And I also think that recognition that workers have a voice at the table, that cleaners, that care workers are essential workers, and that they should have a voice is really important, and it's good that that's starting to happen.
Okay. Well, we're almost out of time here. Maybe I just ask each of you if you want to just take half a minute to make a closing remark. Maybe Joanna, maybe start with you.
Look, I guess where I see the immediate opportunity is investment in social and affordable housing, not just because we absolutely need it, but also because of the job creation potential and the fact that it will keep that residential construction industry alive and provide jobs not just in metro areas but in regional areas, recognising that it is a largely male-dominated industry, so we do need to also be thinking about those job creation initiatives and opportunities that will create jobs for women, but also getting more women into the residential construction industry. But yes, that's where I think we want to focus our efforts in the very short term.
Okay, Bronwen.
Yes, I think it's about making sure we don't deepen disadvantage that already exists, and look at this as a turning point. And I love what Yvonne said about our value system and making sure that we don't just revert to the old way, and we take this new normal as a way to look at things differently and do things differently.
Great. Yvonne.
I think that we can't do it in isolation. We need to be able to, you know, as I said in my welcome, we can't continue to create social isolation. It's a physical distance we need to keep, and all those other practices to keep us all well and safe. But we also need to be mindful that we need to connect. You can have social media and all these other social events, but if we don't connect and really connect in a way, we don't make that change, and we can make the difference if we do it together. So don't just walk for us, walk with us.
Mel.
I would just reinforce that the old normal, as you said at the start of this, is not where we want to go back to. We do have an opportunity to change the way that we live and work and act together, and we should grasp it. And thank you for the opportunity today. It's been really interesting.
All right. Thank you so much to all of you for taking time to share your thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone on the line. Yeah, there's a lot of food for thought here, and we've got our work cut out for us. See you all at the next Committee for Sydney Live event. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.